So, I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning's session with the authors of the new book, or one of the editors of the new book on Precarity and Ageing. Just seeing we're getting more participants rolling in. So just as people do, I'll explain a little bit of the format. So my name's Martin Hyde. I'll be chairing the session. We'll also see Tom Scharf, who's one of the editors of the series on aging in a global context, and he'll talk a little bit about that. Chris, who's also one of the series editors, but also the editor of the book that we are hoping to launch, or we're launching at this virtual session at the BSG. We've had some questions come in on Twitter beforehand, but if people would like to ask a question, you'll see there's a small Q&A function at the bottom. So if you could use that, I'll be looking at the questions as they come in, and then we can ask those to Chris in the latter half of the session. So I'll hand over to Tom shortly, and then after that we'll have a video from Amanda Grenier, who's one of the other editors of the book, and then Chris and I will take Chris will take questions through the Q&A function, and I'll be sort of chairing that for the last 30 minutes or so. So without any further ado, Tom, would you like to talk a little bit about the series and where the book fits in into that?
Martin, and thanks everybody who's joined us at a relatively early hour on a Friday morning on the last day of our annual conference. It seems appropriate to be launching a new book at this time on precarity and aging. So I'm welcoming people to the session on behalf of the co-editors of the book series. That's Chris Phillipson, Tony Calasanti, and myself, to welcome you to the launch of the latest book in the series, which is Precarity and Aging, Understanding Insecurity and Risk in Later Life, a book that's edited by Amanda Grenier, Chris Phillipson, and Richard Setterston. And I've got my own prop here, just to say, you know, this is a fabulous book. It's well worth its place in our series. So the series is published by the Policy Press in association with the British Society of Gerontology, and it reflects a long-standing relationship between the Society and an engaged publisher that has a really strong track record in producing what I think are really excellent books around aging and gerontology. The book series, for those who are not aware, has three broad aims. First, what we want to do is to produce exciting books that really rethink key questions that have shaped debates on social aspects of aging. The books in the series consider themes which move beyond traditional work in gerontology. They refresh or reorientate major areas of research on social and also cultural aspects of aging. Secondly, the series seeks to reflect the global dimensions of aging, and this really addresses a broad range of issues that challenge long-standing debates in gerontology in the global north, adding important new perspectives from the global south. And the third aim of the series is to emphasize the interdisciplinarity in critical perspectives on aging. I think here we want to highlight the benefit of collaborations, not only within the social sciences, but also between the social sciences and the humanities, and across the humanities themselves. So as editors of the series, we hope that this series provides a place where disciplinary boundaries and territories on which studies of aging operate can be scrutinized, can be stretched, can offer opportunities for gerontology to develop new perspectives and innovative approaches to a wide range of topics. The themes of the series are really broad and are there to be extended through new submissions by colleagues who come to us with their excellent ideas. So we are always on the lookout for books that address themes like the environments of aging, social ties in later life, inequalities, across the life course and in later life, ethnicity, transnational migration and aging, ethnographies, social theory and social aging, sustainable development, climate change, aging populations, work and retirement, and also the important role of new technologies and digitalization in relation to aging in later life. So we're always keen for people to come to us with excellent ideas for books. We've already had one or two people through the conference coming forward with some ideas. We hope that people listening in will be brave enough, bold enough to bring us your best ideas. We don't want the ideas that aren't your best ideas. We've got a number of really important books alongside Precarity and Aging that are now in the pipeline, likely to come out in the next year or so. We've got Sheila Peace's work on environments of aging, Anne Leahy on aging and disability, Bethany Simmons looking at aging and the crisis in health and social care, Penny Vera Sansos writing a book on age, gender and poverty in India, and Katie Britton and John Vines are looking at aging and digital technologies. So we are addressing a wide range of the topics in the series, but there are one or two areas where we'd really welcome further input from colleagues in the gerontology community. And these would be books around aging and the climate emergency, for example, or books that focus on social theory and aging. You can access the editor's contact details through the Policy Press web pages. People haven't had great difficulty finding Tony, Chris, or myself over the years in terms of coming forward with ideas. So I'd like to wrap up my introduction just with a word of thanks on behalf of the series editors to our colleagues at Policy Press. They provide brilliant support to the editorial team and also brilliant support to the contributing authors and editors of the series. And I'd like, as president of British Society of Gerontology, to extend my own thanks to everyone involved in making the series a success. The books play a really important part in terms of emphasizing the critical role of gerontology in shaping public debates in moving forward the science around aging and later life. So with that, we move into a short video message from a friend and colleague, Professor Amanda Grenier, who's the Norman and Honey Shipper Chair in Gerontological Social Work at the Factor in Wentash Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto in Canada. Amanda's lead editor of the book, Precarity and Aging. It's a fine book. I recommend it to everyone. So back to you, Martin, and good luck with the rest of the launch.
Thank you very much for that overview of the series, Tom. I fully agree. I think it's been a fantastic contribution to extending our understanding of a wide range of topics in the field. As you said, we're very lucky that Amanda, who obviously for COVID travel restriction reasons can't be with us anyway, but has recorded a short video which I'll now play. So please bear with my technical skills as I try to share screen and do all the funky stuff that we're learning how to do nowadays. I will mute I will see if I can get this.
Good morning, and thank you to BSG and Policy Press for the invitation to virtually launch the edited collection on Precarity and Aging, edited by myself, Amanda Grenier, at the University of Toronto, Chris Phillipson at the University of Manchester, and Rick Sutterston at Oregon State University. I'm delighted to be launching the collection, which includes a range of perspectives on precarity and aging. I wanted to take a few minutes this morning to give you a sense of the collection, how it came together, and what we were hoping to achieve. The collection was prompted by a concern about rising inequality in aging and a feeling that critical gerontology had stalled in its response to understanding and addressing the impacts of the post-2007-2008 financial crash. Our intent was to start a conversation about inequality and disadvantage in social and critical gerontology. The ideas emerging at the time with regards to precarious labor and in cultural studies on vulnerability seem pertinent to the discussion and the critical analysis in aging. The ideas and language, in particular, on precarity seem to offer one response which could cover the variety of concerns affecting the older population across a range of social locations. Indeed, it was this attention to diversity which seemed to make the idea of precarity and precariousness attractive to understanding the issues facing those in employment, moving into retirement, migrants, frailty, for example. Widening the debate from labor-related issues was important, as was connecting with the insecurities, vulnerability, and risks related to care. We approached Policy Press, and they were extremely supportive in this collection, and our work was seen to fit within the Global Aging series. So we then started to invite colleagues who we knew were working in and around what we were calling precarity at the time, asked them to think about the relevance of the concept of precarity, its utility in understanding and addressing disadvantage, and topics and issues that remain marginalized or unseen. You have to forgive me, I can't get into my office yet in Canada, so I do not have the book here to flip through. But the volume is divided into 3 parts: life course perspectives on precarity, precarity across situations, austerity, care, and social responses to precarity. The divisions are loose in some sense, but they're meant to alert the reader to the themes that we're addressing across the collection and to highlight a critical gerontological practice of linking the conceptual with engaged research as a means to spark ideas for change. The first section includes contributions on the life course by Rick Setterston and critical intersections of precarious life, human development, and the life course by Stephen Katz. The life course perspective, developed in part 1, is important for demonstrating how, although situations and late life may illustrate the concentrated forms of precarity, these invariably are building upon events which can be traced back to earlier periods and experiences. At the same time, the point is also made that skills acquired across the life course are themselves very important for responding to events associated with precarity. Part 2 takes the life course framework and precarity and applies this to particular areas of concern, such as employment and migration. It includes my chapter on rereading frailty through precarity, the chapter on ontological precarity of older workers by David Lane and colleagues, precarity, migration, and aging by Karen Kobayashi and Mishira Khan, and a framework to identify precarity in qualitative research by Elena Porticolone. Finally, Part 3 was conceived as a response to the crisis brought about by austerity regimes affecting the organization of welfare. Highlighting the tensions that we saw in work and in care, it includes chapters on reconstructing dependency by Michael Fine, a chapter on precarious employment to precarious retirement by Larry Polivka and Bao Liu, and a chapter on austerity and precarity by Chris Phillipson. All 3 parts address responses to issues relating to more precarious lives, whether through, for example, the framing of social policy, the need for alternative methodologies for studying late life, or for new forms of empowerment developed by older people themselves. Together, the collection offers an argument that the concept and the analysis of precarity provides a language or way of organizing ideas around insecurity and vulnerability, and suggests a way to link this analysis to better understand the relationship with regimes of inequality and discrimination. It goes without saying that the book launch is happening in the midst of the uncertain times brought about by COVID-19. What we see now is that COVID-19 has exposed the precarity, vulnerability, and the impacts of disadvantage, discrimination, exploitation, and inequality. From a critical perspective in gerontology, the causes of precariousness are widening and the impacts of inequality experienced by older people becoming more pronounced. What we see, in a sense, is the amplification of the themes that are addressed across the collection. Situations such as the COVID pandemic raise questions about rising precarity, the tipping point from precarity into hardship, and the extent to which disadvantages carried across the life course may play out in uncertain times and in late life. Our intent was to start a conversation and bring inequality back into critical gerontology. In closing, myself, Chris, and Rick wish to thank Policy Press for the encouragement and support of our ideas and for their work in moving the book into print. Wish to thank the authors who took part in the collection for sharing their ideas and commitment to the project.
So I'd like to extend our thanks virtually to Amanda for taking the time to make that video and sharing it with us. So Chris, we've had a couple of questions coming in on the Q&A that I can see. So, but just as I organise those, is there anything following Amanda's video that you'd like to add to what she said?
No, I'm grateful to Amanda for that introduction. I mean, I think one of the, and building on what she said, one of the crucial things, certainly for me, was that the response of gerontology and critical gerontology in particular, following the financial crash of 2008, had been poor. I mean, I think in many ways, of course, the impact of the crash, the impact of austerity and so on, was huge. And I think it for some reason, I think it proved difficult for gerontologists, steeped perhaps in expectations that things would get better and better, to find a reaction to this. I think it was especially disappointing with critical gerontology, which undoubtedly went into a lull. And in fact, the more vibrant forces in gerontology became those interested in cultural aspects and so on. And those are very important. But I think the kind of more political economy dimensions were lost at a point when those political economy dimensions were urgently needed. And that I think was part of the kind of background to the book, Martin.
And that is a wonderful segue into actually two of the questions that have come through from the audience. And again, if people have questions, please keep posting them on the Q&A function. So the first question really, I think, picks up on that thread really, and asks about the relationship between this notion of precarity and a sort of more long-standing interest in inequalities within gerontology, and whether this is picking up, is it something new, or is it picking up on these kind of long-standing concerns around life course inequalities? So sort of where does precarity sit within that canon of literature that's looked at things like cumulative advantage, disadvantage, and like you said, your own work on sort of critical gerontology?
Sure. I mean, I think we saw it, the editors saw it as a kind of lens through which we could view some of those issues. The big change, which I think also precarity is helpful for alerting us to, is the fact that one of the impacts of the financial crisis has been, the 2008 financial crisis, has been not just cuts to different types of expenditures, but a weakening in the institutions which were supporting older populations. You know, whether that's the welfare state, whether that's the collapse of secure forms of retirement, particularly in the case of men, wherever you see an under-institutionalized society, institutions retreating. Now, we thought that the idea of precarity summed this up rather nicely in a way which went slightly beyond cumulative advantage, disadvantage, and so on, but still keeping the life course perspective. Because one of the arguments in the book, and I think the essay by Richard Setterson is a really superb example, actually. He shows that, he argues that the life course, there's the long reach of the life course, that events earlier in life play through in different ways, develop different types of inequalities. And he explores that, I think, in a particularly interesting way. Just one final point, Martin. I mean, I think the idea of precarity also, and I think we're all keen on this, there is a weakness to the concept, of course, that it implies almost that everybody is succumbing, in a way, to insecurities. But I think it's also possible to see new forms of resistance. And Stephen Katz, in the volume points to this. I try and pick this up. So I think it is important to try and get a balance between insecurity on the one side, but equally patterns of resistance developing on the other. And I don't think, as gerontologists, we know enough about resistance as opposed to insecurity.
I would entirely agree with that. And I was thinking back to the comments made by John Miles at the symposium that you and Amanda had in Manchester on critical gerontology, and pointing out the sort of our lack of understanding of political activism and political kind of engagement in later life. So I think that's definitely an area where we could be doing more work. I'm going to skip a question, but I will return to it. But I think this one leads off very nicely from the one you just talked about, in terms of the connection between precarity and other lenses of looking at kind of inequalities or structured differences, but also the fact that there could be other opportunities in precarity. So someone has asked about how you reflect on the gendered nations of precarity and whether men and women's lives are different. And I suppose here I'm also thinking of the book in the series by Anya and Debbie Street that looked at the experience of women workers in Ireland and America. So how do you see sort of gender intersecting with precarity and the life course potentially?
Yeah, no, I think a number of the chapters do explore that, and in particular take the view that in many ways the crisis that has been unfolding has had a much greater impact on women across a variety of spheres. And Michael Fine addresses this, I think, in terms of the way that female carers have kind of confirmed their status as a significant part of the precariat. And carers, in a way, foreshadow the debate about precarity in many ways, the treatment of carers, both in the global north and global south. I mean, I think really illustrated the kind of intense insecurities, financial, social, existential, which affected that group, but which spilled over into other parts of their lives. And of course, the kind of work that's been going on about pensions and so on that Debbie Price and others have introduced, I think has been terribly important in this regard. So you could say that I think there has been a real challenge to address gender-related issues, but I think precarity does help us to some degree to consider those, particularly in relation to employment and caring. I think they're both very important dimensions.
So just to sort of continue this, I'd like to go to the question that came in via Twitter prior to. So again, I think it's touching on issues around how precarity might impact on different groups of adults as we age. And I think this is particularly pertinent given the impact of the COVID-19 lockdowns that have shown the value of social connectedness. So Robin Hadley has written in and said, if you are not counted, you don't count. And if the people who do the counting won't count you, then you are doubly discounted. Given the reliance of policy and practice on family regarding formal and informal support for older people, how can academia, I suppose in general, but gerontology in particular, build on the existing canon of great work on older childless people to get this invisible and structurally excluded group acknowledged? So again, is this a group that's particularly vulnerable to precarity in the current conditions?
Yes, no, I think Robin, who's really done extraordinarily powerful work on this issue, really makes a very good point, which I must confess I don't think we build upon enough in the book, but I do think it reflects a concern that certainly I've had for some time, that gerontology has been, and social gerontology in particular, was of course largely grounded in a concept of the family, and through Peter Townsend's work and others, the family as a dominant supporter of people in later life and the dominant group that older people would turn to. Over the years, of course, I think we've started to break that down, and through the influence of people like Ray Parle and others, we've argued that, well, actually friends are very important, that other relationships, a much more diverse range of relationships, are important. I don't think still we fully address that within gerontology. I think we're still rather narrow quite often in what we see as counting as an influential social relationship, which could be a stranger, it could be a neighbor, it could be a friend, and it could be a family member, or none of those. And I think that is relevant to the kind of issues which Robin has been exploring. What counts as an intimate tie in later life varies hugely according to where you are, where you live, the kind of life history you've had. And I think bringing in the kind of groups that Robin has talked about and has almost been an advocate for, urging us to be much more prominent in our thinking about them. I think that's very important. But I must confess, I don't think we tackle it enough in the book.
Yeah, well, I think we're all sort of slightly guilty of that, aren't we? We still work with some pre-existing frames, and I think the AWOC group have been fantastic at drawing our attention to what we don't often look at. And then, almost as if people are anticipating your responses, we have another wonderful question that's coming here about how COVID-19 has revealed new sources of precarity. So you've been talking there about different forms of social connectedness, and one of the things that's been hailed as a sort of a positive in some respects, or breakthrough in the current crisis, has been the ability to connect with people digitally. And someone has asked whether COVID-19 has revealed new sources of precarity around digitization, including things such as being digitally excluded. And does lack of access to digital technologies automatically imply being in a precarious situation?
Well, I think for some groups it does. And I think that's a very, very good point. I mean, we got a project going in Manchester doing longitudinal qualitative interviews with people in low-income districts in Greater Manchester. And one of the interviews that I've been doing is with a man who has had difficulties throughout his life, is long-term unemployed, lives in a multi-story block in inner city Manchester, does not have interconnection at home, but he used to go to the library virtually every day to use the internet, which of course he's been unable to do. So he's been at home completely isolated. He has no friends. He has no real friends in the tower block. He's probably perhaps an extreme example of somebody who hasn't built up any relationships, but had been developing interest through the internet, which he has now been blocked to him because of COVID. So I think there are these new forms of exclusion that COVID is exposing. And I'm not terribly optimistic on this. I mean, there are people who say, I heard it argued yesterday, actually, somebody was saying, well, not at the conference, but was saying, well, future cohorts will be technologically savvy and will be all right. But technology moves on, of course, and invites and invents new forms of exclusion. And I think that's something we're going to have to be very careful about in the years ahead, not just assuming that it'll kind of go away, that everybody is going to be included in a few years' time. I think that won't happen. I think there'll always be groups, for whatever reason, will find technology and advances in technology difficult, and that's going to have a big influence on their everyday lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for all of us, it's exposed how reliant we've been on technologies and what happens when you can't get your Tesco delivery done. If you live in a village in South Wales and you have to walk, like I do, a mile plus to get to the supermarket. So I think it has done that on a bigger scale than maybe we thought about. So the other big, world global situation that we simply, can't not talk about currently is the Black Lives Matter protests and, wave of kind of resistance that have followed what's been happening in the States, but also more widely. And we have two questions that relate to that really. So I'll take them sort of both together. But how does gerontology, and this is a big question, so I don't necessarily expect the full answer, but it is part of a conversation that we need to start having, I suppose. But how does gerontology in general, I think, but the precarity approach in particular, address issues around structural racism and experiences of people of colour or minority ethnic groups? And how do you see that as part of what we're doing and what you're doing?
Well, I've got a very clear view about this. I have started to argue and reflected on about the issue in a paper which I wrote a couple of years ago, that gerontology has always been picked up ageism as a really important issue, and spends an awful lot of time going on about ageism. The impact of racism through the life course barely figures. But for people who live in countries like the UK and the US, and who experience racism in the educational system, primary, secondary, tertiary, who go through life experiencing racism on the streets, stop and search, disproportionate, likely to be picked up during the present crisis, or challenged on the streets by the police. We know virtually nothing about the impact of those experiences when they reach later life, Martin. And I think we've really got to prioritize this in gerontology. I mean, if I see one more study of ageism, review of the literature on ageism, it's ridiculous, frankly. We know enough about ageism. It's important, of course it's important. But as an area of research, frankly, I think it's hollowed out. Let's start balancing it out with other forms of discrimination. Racism for me is fundamental here in terms of, it does illustrate a fault line, unfortunately, within the discipline of gerontology, particularly in the UK, where we've been poor at funding research on Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, very poor in terms of major funding streams, and lack of knowledge about successive waves of groups coming into the UK. I mean, I've been particularly interested in the Bangladeshi community, and others have done brilliant work on other communities. Fantastic people like James Nasru at Manchester. But I mean, we really need to prioritize this area, because discrimination, racism is constantly changing, of course, constantly morphing into different forms of experiences which people have, which impact on later life in particular ways.
Yeah, I mean, I read Sandra Torres's book in the series on ethnicity and aging, and that for me again was an eye-opener, not just in terms of pointing out some of our knowledge gaps around, like you said, other forms of oppression and the intersection of racism and ageism, but just the ways in which gerontology does, or kind of more clearly doesn't think about ethnicity, that tends to go for sort of the off the peg categorizations that are used in official surveys. And I thought it's a very interesting book to read, to kind of try to understand the complexity of how aging and ethnicity intersect across the life course, but also our role as researchers in framing those experiences through the language and the measures that we use. So again, I would recommend people to read that book as well.
I think it'd be good, perhaps, Martin, I think it'd be good, having raised this, if perhaps at next year's BSG, we did have a major symposium on issues about racism and addressing how gerontology, social gerontology, research is and reacts to that. I mean, there are some great people doing research in this area who I think could really, lead on that and perhaps push for greater funding research, push for supporting researchers from the community as well, who are often, I mean, Nilüfer Ahmed was on a symposium yesterday, which John Miles put together, who was pointing out the pressures on early career researchers from Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, invariably on soft money contracts. And the research capacity issue has to be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of to pick up on a point that Penny has made as well, I think around that, and I think quite, pertinent about that, the lens of precarity being a useful one there. If we're talking about racism and Black Lives Matter, then precarity is that devaluation of life becomes precariousness, that life becomes precarious through the experience of racism. And she says, it might help us to understand which lives gain value, which sustain it, which never gain it again, or which lose it more quickly than others. And I was talking to my partner yesterday, and she was saying, some of the statistics coming out about the rates of incarceration in the US, particularly amongst kind of young Black men, and the problem that has for the life cost, because you're really unable to get back into the labour market because of the reluctance to employ former convicts or even people that have been acquitted. So there's been obviously there's been a lot of stuff on TV around that. So I think it would be a very it'd be nice if we could do something sooner, but I think you're right, something at the BSG that really starts to answer some of the bigger questions. Would be
we needn't wait. It's true. We needn't wait till next year. We could, perhaps we could, that could be done anytime as a special, session where the society took the lead in addressing social research. How has social research addressed a whole range of issues there? Yeah, I think that we ought to pursue that. That's one for Tom Scharf, I think, to take up. I don't know whether he's listening.
He snuck off into the audience, so he's anonymous. I'm trying to pick out which one of the questions are his. Sheila's asked, and again, I think from my perspective as well as somebody who writes about globalization, she's asking about how do you see precarity from a global perspective? Is this something that is peculiar to the sort of Anglo-American debate, or is it something that would find resonance in other parts of the world, and is it something that we address at the global level or at the local level?
I think you can do both, Sheila. I mean, I think there is clearly a transnational dimension here, most obviously to migration and caring, carers who move countries to work in and support richer older people, or work in residential and nursing homes, sending remittances back. They're a very precarious group who live often in very precarious conditions. And of course, a group who face huge challenges in the context of the pandemic. I mean, migrants who move across the world in search of work, sending remittances back, are now an extremely vulnerable group for a whole range of reasons. Often the conditions in which they live in the host country are ones that expose them to the virus much more severely. But also the questions of how far they're going to be able to travel backwards and forwards, of course, now is very difficult. All of these questions really are being transformed by COVID-19. And I do think the precarity lens is valuable actually for looking at it. So I think global and local, Sheila, but I think that example of transnational migration does strike me as being one that's very relevant here.
Yeah, I mean, again, some of the work that I've done around work and health in India as well, I think that this has exposed the unsustainability of an economy that's built on 90% of informal people in the labour market. And it's not just transnational migration, is it? We've seen the problems of people being forced to go back to their sort of home, town within India.
In India, yeah.
And that's been really harrowing, because you realise there's no support systems there for them to do that, and often they've had to walk, hundreds of miles to get back with very little. So, I agree. I think it has a resonance on a global scale, and I think again COVID has exposed this. Now, I've been saving this question to last, and I think I'll make it our last question. I think it's been an amazing talk, and you've answered pretty much every question, from the local to the global, taking history and geography in. But I thought this was a nice question to end on, really. So someone has said, Chris has been engaged in important work on critical approaches to aging for many years, helping to define the field. How would a precarity perspective have helped him shape his work had this idea been around in the 1970s or 80s?
That's a great question. I think it would have made me more aware of the fragility of institutions. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, we, in a sense, although if you worked in a Marxist political economy perspective, you kind of thought that the welfare state would survive. You kind of thought, I mean, I was very interested in retirement, for example, and I kind of assumed that retirement would keep going, that the task was to make it better for people. And I kind of assumed that we would eventually get rid of the idea that old age was a burden. But, all of these things have proved actually quite fragile. The welfare state is clearly in a very, very, very fragile state in so many ways, failing to support people at the most difficult period of their lives, and that's awful. I mean, what's happened in residential care, I think for all of us gerontologists, has been, awfully dreadful things that have gone on for carers and obviously for older people, and it has exposed a society which I think in the 70s and 80s we thought, through our writing, through our research, there could be really major improvements in these difficult transitions. Of course there have been, but I think the concept of precarity has indicated the degree to which structural change has to be a fundamental factor in what we do, and that without that, old age will continue to be experienced as deeply insecure and something which people really are often more frightened of than they should be. And I think that's the issue that I think precarity has raised in my mind.
I would agree. I think, even thinking from when I started, the world has changed tremendously in ways that I don't think that we were prepared for from our kind of research perspective. So I very much welcome the book as a opening foray into us rethinking how we do this, and to kind of exposing these new forms of inequalities and precariousness. I would like to thank you very, very much. Is there anything else that you would like to say that we haven't sort of picked up in the questions, or an extra plug for the book if necessary?
Well, I appreciate however many people have come on at 9 o'clock in the morning, and grateful as ever for the community of gerontologists is terrific, and always been grateful for the support it's given me, and I know that's Amanda in particular would say that as well.
Well, I would echo your thanks. We've had around 60 people participating with us today. I'm going to wrap this up now, because I'm also aware that we're all getting zoomed out, and this is the end of 3 days of this. So thank you so much for all your contributions. Like Tom said at the start, if people are interested in submitting a proposal to the series, they can drop him an email, or Chris, or Tony Calasanti, or get in touch with Policy Press as well. So hopefully this will have stimulated some ideas for people to write future books. I can see on the chat as well that's just popped up that I think there is a significant interest in doing something more around people of colour, minority ethnic groups. So I think that could be a new clarion call for some activities throughout this year as well. So I will say goodbye to everyone and hopefully catch you in the other sessions in the conference today. And again, to say thank you very much to Tom for talking about the series, particularly for Chris for taking the time to give us such an enlightening Q&A. So goodbye and thank you very much.